you saw me get up and sort of change the reading, because we have two choices today. One of the choices would be for the memorial, and that was right. You chose the right one. But I had prepared my homily on the first reading for the other readings. So guess who wins? The reading that we heard is from 1 Corinthians. Corinth was a wonderful city. It was a port city. And it was filled with all sorts of new ideas. Paul stayed there about 2 years, 2.5 years, and things went well while he was preaching. But the second he left, things started falling apart. Some people started factions, other people lived immorally. And we hear one of the difficulties here, how they celebrate the Eucharist. Paul speaks about them joining for the Lord's Supper. Nowadays, when we say the Lord's Supper, we think of Mass. But they meant a supper. That's how the first Mass was celebrated, at an actual meal. So the people would all bring their food, eat their meal, and then they would bless the bread and the wine to make it the Eucharist. They didn't have an hour fast before, like we do. Remember, the hour fast is not from the beginning of Mass. It's from the time you receive communion. And you can swallow your spit during that hour. You think I'm making that one up? So they had this huge meal, but the people who were rich, they brought their lobster bisque, crab imperial, where the people who were poor, very often slaves, came in at the last minute, had hardly anything to eat. And the rich folk didn't share with the poor folk. So Paul says, you're sinning against the Eucharist. Now, what does he mean by that? We have to remember that there's different ways of looking at the Eucharist. One of the ways that Paul mentions earlier in the letter is that the Eucharist is union with Jesus. We receive his flesh and blood, and we and he become one. So much so that if you're willing to genuflect on your way out of chapel, maybe you should think about genuflecting to the people around you too, because each one of us becomes a tabernacle. We hold the very presence of Jesus, which is why in the parking lot, please don't run anybody over. We should act like Jesus. But in this passage, he's talking about the Eucharist as horizontal. The Eucharist is communion that we form in community, that we have an obligation to treat each other as if they were Christ. And therefore, if we're sinning against them, then we're not really living that communion. Lady said to me, Father, I go to Mass 6 days a week. There's only one day I don't go. I said, which one? She said, Sunday. I said, wait a minute. I think you missed the point. She says, no. On Sunday, they have all those babies. They have all the people moving around. I can't really pray. And so I said to her, I really admire your faith. It's a great theory. Notice the little dig. It's a theory, it's not lived. Because we also have to live at this horizontal level. Which is holier? Genuflecting to the tabernacle or yakking with a friend? Well, hopefully we're yakking outside the chapel, but both are holy because both help build up the body of Christ. It's fascinating that Paul would be able to say this when he wrote this letter. Why is it fascinating? This is the first time the Eucharist is mentioned in any of the New Testament writings. This is only 20 years after the Last Supper. And already they realize that the Eucharist is union with God, union with each other. So you notice how quickly this took on importance. Now, he does mention one thing. From now on, if you're going to eat supper, eat it at home before you show up. So he's trying to make sure that they celebrate in a dignified way. Later in the century, St. John's going to add a third dimension to the Eucharist. Remember when Jesus rises from the dead and the disciples are fishing, and he says, try the other side of the boat. They catch 153 fish, and they get to shore, and Jesus serves them with bread and fish. Does that sound familiar? Bread and fish meal? Remember when he multiplied the bread and loaves? This is Eucharist. And then what does he tell the disciples? Go and preach the good news. The third dimension of Eucharist is mission. When you leave this chapel, we should be changed people. Just by the smile on our face, people should see that we've changed. I heard one priest say, the way people leave church, you'd swear they were tortured the last hour. So we might as well have big banners in front of our church. Come and be miserable with us. And after we have the Sunday morning Mass, we should go to the local diner with some of our friends and have so much fun. The owner threatens to kick us out because the owner thinks we're drunk. Remember Pentecost Sunday? That's what they said about the apostles. People should be able to see that we're changed. Sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle. So what is the Eucharist? The Eucharist is so many things beyond what we can understand. But at the very least, we're one with Jesus, one with each other, and one with our mission.